This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So this is sort of a segue episode. We just wrapped up a lot of information about cases that took place along I-70. And I wanted to transition over to something that I ended up researching because we were researching that.
Right.
It's an interesting case, but it comes out of like a court ruling that like this is able to happen at all. Have you ever heard of Furman versus Georgia?
Yes.
So this is a 1972 holding, and it's a Supreme Court case. The background on this case is kind of interesting. You've got a homeowner who awakes in the middle of the night to find William Henry Furman committing burglary in his home. So Furman's a guy, he's got a sixth grade education. He's been adjudicated emotionally disturbed and mentally impaired. The case takes place on August 11th of 1967. In September of 1968, he gets a one-day trial for this burglary. So here's like what the Supreme Court like ruling kind of includes in it, and then we'll talk a little bit about this. There's an unsworn statement that was allowed into the trial by Georgia, quote, criminal procedure. Furman says that he's trying to escape from this house because he's been caught and that he tripped and he had a gun on him that was loaded, safety off. And when he trips, that weapon fires accidentally and kills the victim. Now, you and I have talked about this kind of off the recording quite a bit. We've talked about the fact that a large number of murders happen because someone wasn't really prepared, like during a crime.
Usually during a robbery, it's a trigger finger incident, meaning that a sudden, unexpected, whatever, being startled, they pull the trigger.
Yeah. So the victim in this case, his name is William Joseph Mickey Jr. And so Furman goes up for his murder. He has a one-day trial. And essentially, the Supreme Court ends up getting involved. Now, the way that Georgia put all of this up is they said Furman's contradicting his prior statement to police. Now, that statement to police was he was about to flee the house and he turned around into like the darkness of the house and he fired a single shot. But either way, and either, whether it's an accident or it's a blind shot in the dark, because the shooting occurred during the commission of a burglary, in this case, a midnight burglary, it's the commission of a felony. He ends up being eligible for the death penalty under, at the time, the felony murder rule, because he's guilty of murder during the commission of a felony. So he gets tried and he gets found guilty because whichever statement you want to call it, whether it was an accident or he fired blindly into the house, he's technically guilty of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. He gets sentenced to death. But that punishment never gets carried out. There's another case called Jackson versus Georgia. It's also a death penalty case It was confirmed up through the Supreme Court of Georgia. But in that case, the man who's convicted had instead attempted to commit armed robbery. And while he's committing the armed robbery, he had committed rape. There's other cases that they reference in here too. Branch versus Texas comes into this. And that's another case similar to Jackson v. Georgia. Branch was convicted of rape in that case. So here's what the Supreme Court says about all of this. And this, okay, so the way that this works for people who maybe aren't familiar with like appellate processes. So typically you show up in your first appearances are in a district court. If they're felonies, they move to a superior court. In a lot of jurisdictions, you're then indicted by a grand jury and you go on trial before either a jury of your peers or before a judge if it's a bench trial. And then if you lose at that level, at the superior court level, you would appeal up to a smaller panel of appellate court judges, and it's usually called the Court of Appeals, and like it could be the Georgia Court of Appeals or North Carolina Court of Appeals. And then you've got one more step where you can move up in the state level. Usually that's the name of the state, and it's a Supreme Court. Like in this case, the Georgia Supreme Court would have had the early parts of this case. So once you're done there, it shifts from the state court system over to the federal court systems. And you have to have different reasons to file a case in federal court. I'm not going to get into all of them right this second because they're sort of long. But what we were dealing with here was the possibility that imposing the death penalty on William Henry Furman could potentially violate his 8th and 14th Amendment rights. So the 8th Amendment right most people know it as protecting citizens against excessive bail or excessive punishments. And then the 14th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction Amendments. It's usually used to address equal protection under the law. The bottom line is the question was, would imposing the death penalty on William Henry Furman constitute a cruel and unusual punishment or a violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments?
I think it's important to mention here. So the reason that it went from, where it started with his indictment and his trial through the appeals courts all the way to the state Supreme Court and then on to the United States Supreme Court was the Georgia State Supreme Court found that the ruling and sentence in his case, it adhered to the laws of the state of Georgia, right?
Yeah.
And so there was no error that needed to be overturned. And his attorney said, well, the ruling may adhere to the laws of the state of Georgia, but the laws of the state of Georgia are violating the Constitution. And so they took the constitutional question to the United States Supreme Court, which is largely the jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court. In fact, they can have original jurisdiction over questions like that, depending on how the case progresses, right? But basically, he had lost all these appeals, but the thought was, it doesn't matter that it followed the law of the state. It's against our constitutional rights as citizens of the United States.
Correct. The decision comes out, and it's a per curiam decision, per curiam opinion for the holding. Per curiam means that it's not an individual justice in this case who is writing it up. It literally means by the court.
Well, and it means in this case, it means the whole court. So sometimes there'll be one or two justices that don't participate in certain cases for whatever reason.
Right.
They can recuse themselves, they can just be busy, whatever. But in this case, everybody was present for it.
Right. And so it's an interesting decision they come up with. It's a 5-4 decision, which means it's a narrow decision. So it's 5 is the holding majority. I'm going to read the whole thing, and it's weirdly not going to take that long because the court only issues one paragraph.
Well, and I don't know if I should say this before or after, but this is very interesting because this is the reason that some states now have the death penalty and some don't.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. So this is to just belabor that one more time. That means this is a landmark decision.
Correct.
And there's a number of things that happen here that are quite interesting. The majority of the court, the 5, they could not agree as to any kind of rationale here, but they held the imposition of the death penalty in cases similar to the Furman case, and they attached other cases in here, constituted cruel and unusual punishment and was a violation of the Constitution, including the 8th and the 14th Amendments. Even though they couldn't agree to a rationale, meaning they weren't going to sign on with everything, what they did do is they spelled out their holding kind of short and sweet. We have Justices Potter Stewart, Byron White, and William O. Douglas at the time expressing similar concerns about the fact that there was an apparent arbitrariness with which death sentences were imposed by the laws that existed. And they all said that there was an indication there might be a racial bias against Black defendants. Because these opinions were very narrow, finding only that the death penalty as currently applied would be cruel and unusual, this was considered to be a controlling majority opinions. But Stewart wrote this: "These death sentences are cruel and unusual in the same way that being struck by lightning is cruel and unusual. For all of the people convicted of rapes and murders in 1967 and 1968, many just as reprehensible as these, the petitioners are among a capriciously selected random handful upon which the sentence of death has in fact been imposed. My concurring brothers have demonstrated that if any basis can be discerned for the selection of these few to be sentenced to death, it is the constitutionally impermissible basis of race." They refer here to a 1964 case called McLaughlin versus Florida, which had a holding related to that. He says, "But racial discrimination has not been proved, and I put it to one side. I simply conclude that the 8th and 14th Amendments cannot tolerate the infliction of a sentence of death under legal systems that permit this unique penalty to be so wantonly and so freakishly imposed." Now we've got William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall both chiming in as justices with a piece of this conclusion. And here's what they say. They concluded that the death penalty was in itself, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, and that it was incompatible with the evolving standards of decency of a contemporary society. Thurgood Marshall commented further on the possibility of wrongful execution, and he wrote, "No matter how careful courts are, the possibility of perjured testimony, mistaken honest testimony, and human error remain too real. We have no way of judging how many innocent persons have been executed, but we can be certain that there were some." And I'm not turning this into a political thing. I'm not talking about like for or against the death penalty. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about the 4. So that was from the 5. The 5 are Potter Stewart, Byron White, William O. Douglas, William J. Brennan, and Thurgood Marshall. The 4 on the other side of this opinion were Chief Justice Warren Burger and Justices Harry Blackmun, Lewis F. Powell, and William H. Rehnquist. Not that it matters. Those were all appointees from President Richard Nixon's era. They dissented from what was going on here. They argued that a punishment provided in 40 state statutes at the time and by the federal government could not be ruled contrary to the so-called evolving standard of decency. The four also stated that they personally held opposition to the death penalty. They would vote against it if on the state legislature, but that it was a constitutional punishment nonetheless. In Chief Justice Berger's dissent, he wrote, "In the 181 years since the enactment of the Eighth Amendment, not a single decision of this court has cast the slightest shadow of a doubt on the constitutionality of capital punishment." So I'm just throwing that out there. And Furman is really important to what we're doing today. Otherwise, I wouldn't sit here and sort of drag people through the legalese. I feel like Furman was important in a lot of ways because it caused this massive pause on capital punishment.
It did. And the Supreme Court's decision required all death sentences that were in place at that time to be vacated and reduced to sentences of life imprisonment.
Yeah. So this is the first time the justices in any measure have vacated a death sentence under the Eighth Amendment. So the Eighth Amendment, by them doing this, sort of the effect of that is that capital punishment for the time being was found to be cruel and unusual. And it resulted in more than 650 death sentences being vacated.
Right.
And like you said, the alternative there was these 600 and what some odd sentences were reduced to life imprisonment.
And so the majority holding there, they were saying basically that because there are just two of the opinion that ruled in favor of this, that said that they were against the death penalty altogether, right?
Right.
And then the other ones of the opinion, they were basically saying that we've taken a look at all this, and in this particular case, with the circumstances surrounding this case, we can't really figure out why this guy got the death penalty under the circumstances in this situation versus all the other people that have committed crimes that could be on the same level as this, and they didn't get the death penalty. Right. And that's what they're analyzing there. And that's why they say that it's arbitrarily applied. And they saw something in the information that made them consider that it was more likely that if you were Black and arrested for this type of crime, and I guess a male too, right? A man.
Yes.
That you would be put to death as opposed to not being Black or a man. Right. And
Correct.
So basically what they were saying was, the states can't practice this arbitrarily. The obvious answer to that is to put less people to death, not more, right? I mean, I think they had to have seen, and we don't have access. I mean, I guess there might be a record somewhere where we could see what the court used to come up with it. But they basically were just saying, hold on, the death penalty needs to be for the worst of the worst cases, and it needs to kind of be evenly applied.
Yeah. The primary thing that they were trying to avoid here was, I'll say it in these words, they did not want capital punishment to be administered in a capricious or discriminatory manner. This forces the states and kind of by proxy, Congress, because the federal system had the death penalty, to look at their statutes for anything that could result in a capital punishment, so all their capital offenses, and to figure out how to, going forward, make sure that the death penalty was not being arbitrarily imposed in any jurisdiction, in any state, or in any federal court. So over the next 4 years, 37 states change up their capital punishment statutes to meet this requirement. Now, this is where we affect not just capital punishment, but specifically capital punishment at the time. It's where we end up in these bifurcated trials. So at this time, a lot of trials become two parts, the first of which is establishing, quote, guilt or innocence, end quote. And then the second part is establishing appropriate sentencing. And standards were put into place in most of those jurisdictions that would guide what discretion juries and judges had when it came to death penalty cases. Now, there's another series of sentences that happens. There's another series of decisions that start happening in 1976. And probably the first one you could read about there would be Gregg versus Georgia. So again, we're back in Georgia, where going forward with capital punishment, there are additional requirements attached to the death penalty. And that continues. I don't know when the last major capital punishment decision was made, but I'm guessing that continues well into the 2000s. Although it gets a little nitpicky. We're not going there today. The whole reason for me bringing up Furman is because Furman, in my opinion, is the only reason we have the next case. You think that's an accurate sentence?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So our case for today, it begins in 1946. And there's a kid born down in a town called Rosebud in Texas. He's going to be the fifth of 6 siblings. His father is running a successful concrete business during this massive construction boom in Texas in the 1960s. So being the 5th kid, he's not quite the youngest, but he's pretty close. His mom is named Addie. She is known as being kind of a hard ass on anyone who comes across thinking less of her children or thinking her children could potentially be hoodlums, I guess would be the right word. This kid, born March 21st, 1946, his name is Kenneth, and he has a twin brother named Lonnie. Now, he goes all through school, and he earns the reputation of being a little bit of a bully. He was always, according to what I've read about him, he was picking on weaker individuals. Now, he himself is not super strong, but he grows in high school to be very big. In fact, from the pictures I've seen of him, I don't know if you know this about him, he looks like Jason from the Friday the 13th movies, like size-wise.
Yeah, I agree.
He's
really tall.
Yeah. He's 6'5" and 200 and some pounds. He's not super muscular, but there's one picture I saw of him wearing coveralls, and I thought, oh my gosh, put a hockey mask on him. He looks just like Jason. He doesn't get along well in school, and he picks a fight one day that he loses. He's picking on a pretty popular kid that is also an athlete at his high school. After this happens, he quits the school and he decides that he's going to go to work for his father's concrete business, which he's not great at. He ends up only really being able to do manual labor there. But he starts side jobs all over the town. One of the things that he does for side jobs is he mows lawns for money. And somewhere around the time that he's 17 or 18 years old, he really starts using these side jobs as a way to case houses in his town and in as far out as 3 neighboring counties. His criminal record starts out with 1964. When he's 18 years old, Kenneth ends up being charged with 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary in Bell County, Milam County, and Falls County. He ends up being sentenced to 12 4-year prison terms, but the judge makes them servable concurrently. And we've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, so if you're serving them consecutively, that means if you got 12 4-year terms, you would be serving a total of 48 years. But because he's serving them concurrently, he's only doing 4 years. And he doesn't even end up doing that. He is out on parole by December of 1965. He gets into a fight, and his parole is revoked, and he gets sent back to prison. but they hold him, I think it was about 90 days, and he gets almost right back out of prison. So at the time, he's not done anything yet that has caught the eye of authorities in terms of committing a major violent felony. But it is said that he had been bragging about having raped and killed 2 young women. So this guy's name is Kenneth McDuff. Had you heard of him before we started talking about all this?
I don't think so. I can't really remember, but I don't think so.
Well, I know we're talking about this crime in the 60s, but the way this guy comes on the radar is up into a point, me verifying his timeline in life, he was actually a pretty decent suspect in the I-70 murders to a point, but he doesn't match the physical description as much. And I had also looked at him for some crimes in Texas, but it wasn't available for that. So just so people are aware, everything I'm talking about here, I was looking at this guy for crimes in 1992, and we're talking about him in what's going to be 1966. He gets popped in 1966 with a guy named Roy Dale Green for a series of crimes that is referred to today as the Broomstick Murders. The Broomstick Murders took place on August 6th of 1966. And Kenneth McDuff and Roy Green, they had met during the summer through a mutual friend. But that day, they were working for Kenneth's dad at his concrete business. They got bored and they started driving around, and they were, quote, looking for a girl. At around 10 p.m., Robert Brand, who was 17 years old, his girlfriend Edna Sullivan, who was 16, and Brand's 15-year-old cousin, Mark Dunman, were standing beside their parked car on a baseball field in Everman, Texas. So while Kenneth and Roy are cruising around, Kenneth notices Edna Sullivan. So he parks his car kind of close to the baseball field, and he walks up to them and he threatens them with a .38 caliber Colt revolver. And he puts all of them into the trunk of their car. So Roy Green follows him while Kenneth McDuff drives the victim's Ford along a highway. And he pulls off into a field, and he gets Edna Sullivan out of the trunk. And then he instructs Roy Green to put her into the trunk of the other car. At this point, and this is all according to Roy Green's statement and his confession, Kenneth said that he wanted to knock him off. And he proceeds to fire 6 shots into the trunk of the Ford, in spite of, this 15-year-old kid and this 17-year-old kid begging him not to do it. So then he has Roy Green wipe down the Ford to get rid of any fingerprints. He drives to another location, and now we're back in his car, in his Dodge. And Green is telling him that he wants to get out of the car, according to his testimony. And Kenneth tells him he can't. So when they get to this other location, they rape Edna Sullivan. And after she had been raped repeatedly, Kenneth tells Green to go find something for him to knock her off. Green gives him his belt. But instead of that, Kenneth goes back to his car and he finds a 3-foot-long piece of broomstick that's in his car. He chokes Edna Sullivan to death. And then he and Green take her body and they dump it under some bushes. They then drive to Hillsboro on the way to Roy Green's house, and they stop and they get a Coca-Cola. They spend the night at Roy Greene's house, and the following day, Kenneth buries his revolver on Roy Greene's property, in like next to his garage. And they call this guy Richard Boyd, who they both know, and he lets Kenneth come to his house to wash his car. But the next day, Roy Greene confesses to Richard Boyd's parents. Richard Boyd's parents pick up the phone and they call Roy Greene's mother. And Roy Greene's mother tells him that he's got to turn himself in. Kenneth ends up getting arrested by the Falls County Sheriff at the time and a deputy U.S. Marshal. In this case, Kenneth receives a death sentence. He's sentenced to death. He's going into the electric chair in Texas. Roy Greene testifies against him, and he ends up receiving a 25-year sentence. But he gets released about 12 years after the trial. Kenneth's death sentence ends up being commuted to a life sentence under Furman versus Georgia. So he hires a lawyer, and the lawyer puts together various evidence, and they claim that Roy Greene was the actual killer and that Kenneth had nothing to do with the murders. So they take this massive collection. I think it's referred to as a dossier in one of the sources, and they present it to the parole board. And the parole board does some one-on-one interviews with Kenneth McDuff. McDuff, like an idiot, tries to bribe one of the members of the parole board, and they call him out on it. And this was to secure a favorable decision on his parole application. They don't take the bribe, and they turn him in. And he ends up getting a 2-year sentence for trying to bribe the official. So, regardless of this happening, the parole board decides that Kenneth is probably still able to contribute to society, and they grant him parole. So in 1989, he gets out. So McDuff is one of only 20 former death row inmates and roughly 127 murderers that are paroled in Texas. After being released, he goes to work at a gas station, making about $4 an hour. And he starts to take classes at Texas State Technical College, which is in Waco, Texas. According to what's been put together on him, and there's a source here that's a 1992 article by Gary Cartwright. It was published in the Texas Monthly, and it's been republished since then. It's called Free to Kill. It's a good source for this if you're looking for more about Kenneth. It's believed that within 3 days of his release, he started killing again. On October 14th of 1989, the body of 29-year-old Seraphia Parker was discovered in Tempe, which is a town about 48 miles south of Waco, and it's along I-35. Kenneth McDuff is never charged in this crime. But he makes a death threat to a black kid in Rosebud, and his parole is violated, and he goes back to prison. Addie McDuff, so mom, she pays $1,500 and then $700 in expenses to a couple of attorneys out of Huntsville, Texas, to give her an honest evaluation on her son's prospect for getting a release. And shortly after they get to work on this, on December 18th, 1990, Kenneth McDuff is out of prison again. I'm going to hold that for just a second. So this is a guy that's sentenced to death, Mag.
Yep.
Because of the decision in Furman versus Georgia, he gets out after roughly 20 years.
I just want to point out the Supreme Court ruling on Furman didn't say anything about granting them parole.
Totally agree with you. He gets a life sentence instead of a death sentence because of that, and then he somehow finagles his way out.
Right. And so yes, Furman had something to do with it, but at the same time, it didn't say that they had to be granted the possibility of parole. Who knows how this happened?
On the night of October 10th, 1991, so 10 months after he gets out of prison, he picks up a sex worker named Brenda Thompson in Waco, Texas. He ties her up, but then he stops his truck about 50 feet away from a police checkpoint. When police start walking toward Kenneth McDuff's vehicle, Brenda starts kicking at the windshield of McDuff's truck, and it cracks the windshield from the inside. McDuff stomps on the gas, and he drives at the officers. According to a statement filed by the officers at the checkpoint that night, 3 of them had to jump out of the way to avoid being hit by Kenneth McDuff's truck. The police chase him. McDuff eludes them by turning off his lights and going the wrong way down several one-way streets. And then he parks his truck in a wooded area near Route 84. And he tortures Brenda Thompson to death. Her body is not going to be discovered until 1998. 5 days after this, on October 15th, 1991, McDuff again picks up a sex worker. This sex worker is named Virginia Deanne Moore. She's 21 years old, and she is witnessed having an argument outside of a Waco motel with Kenneth McDuff. Shortly after this, the 2 of them drive in Kenneth McDuff's pickup truck to a remote area beside Texas Highway 6 near Waco. McDuff ties her arms and her legs with pantyhose, and then he kills her. She is also discovered September 29th of 1998. So she was missing for 7 years by the time her body gets found. It is also believed that Kenneth McDuff murdered Cynthia Renee Gonzalez, and she was 23. She was found dead in a creek bed near County Road 313 in a heavily wooded area about a mile west of I-35 on September 21st of 1991. She had been missing for 6 days at the time from Arlington, Texas. So McDuff is one of those rare dudes that picks up accomplices along the way. We've already talked about Roy Green, and he finds a new accomplice in December of 1991 named Alva Hank Worley. That night, he picks up a woman named Colleen Reed from Louisiana. They drive her to a car wash. So the way that this crime goes, McDuff and Alva Worley, they drive to a car wash in Austin. And they kidnap Colleen Reed in plain sight of multiple eyewitnesses and drive away. And Alva Worley admitted in an April of 1992 interview with the Bell County Sheriff's Department that he had raped Reed and that he had tortured her with cigarettes, but that he did not participate in her murder. Next up on the list is a sex worker named Valencia Joshua. She was last seen alive knocking on Kenneth McDuff's door. He strangles Valencia on February 24th of 1992. Her body is discovered on March the 15th at a golf course near a college that McDuff was attending. Next up was a 22-year-old store clerk who worked at a Waco, Texas Quick Pack, which was the same store that at one point Kenneth McDuff had worked at. Her name was Melissa Northrup. She was pregnant when she went missing from the store. Whoever kidnapped her also took $250 from the cash register. McDuff ends up a suspect there because he had been seen near the Quick Pack at the time that Melissa went missing. During the investigation, but before her body is found, a friend of Kenneth McDuff's from the technical college told police officers that Kenneth kept trying to get him to help rob the store. Melissa Northrup died on March 1st, 1992, but her body was not found until April 26th. It's found by a fisherman. One of the major problems at this point for investigators in tracking all of this is that they don't necessarily know all of these murders are related. He is doing this across multiple Texas counties at the time. So there's not really a coordinated effort to find out who's committing these crimes, because at the time, police aren't really aware that these crimes are connected. But they do find out that McDuff is carrying around a gun. He's also selling drugs. And the Texas police consider both of these things to be federal offenses. So on March 6th of 1992, a local state's attorney issues a warrant for the arrest of Kenneth McDuff on those charges. And in April of 1992, Bell County investigators, they bring in Alva Worley, and they question him on the basis that he was a known acquaintance of Kenneth McDuff. Worley basically just spills on everything related to Colleen Reed's case. He gets held in the Travis County Jail, and the police go out searching for McDuff. By this point, Kenneth had moved up to Kansas City, Missouri, and he was working for trash collection and recycling company. But he was living under the name Richard Fowler. And on May 1st of 1992, a coworker of his named Gary Smythe, he's watching the Fox television program America's Most Wanted. And Gary notices that his new coworker, Richard, is really similar to this guy, McDuff, that they're talking about on the program. So after talking to another coworker, he calls the Kansas City Police Department. They search Fowler's name, and they find that he had been arrested and he had been fingerprinted for soliciting sex workers. A comparison of the fingerprints taken from Richard Fowler when compared to those of Kenneth McDuff show that they're the same person. So on May 4th of 1992, a surveillance team of 6 officers arrests Kenneth McDuff as he drives to a landfill in Kansas City. I thought this was pretty interesting. I don't know if you know this, but the arresting officers here were related to the arresting officers from Kenneth's, I think it was their dads that had done it, from his first arrest for the broomstick murders.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
So the way that this sort of rolls out for Kenneth after May of 1992, he gets put on trial in June. He's indicted Kenneth gets indicted on 1 count of capital murder, and this is for the Quick Pack incident where he took Melissa Northrup. So he gets indicted on a capital murder charge on June 26th of 1992, and he ends up being found guilty. In Texas now, juries determine whether or not an individual convicted of capital murder gets life imprisonment or the death penalty. So I don't know that there could be any better argument for the death penalty than this guy. How do you feel about that part?
I have some questions about, well, I guess to answer that question, some of it, like, for example, the kidnapping and, like, plain view of witnesses and his victim that was last seen at, like, going into his house. Like, there's some pretty strong indications he's probably guilty of these crimes, right?
Yeah.
As long as it went through the process, yeah, I would say that this dude illustrates a lot of things. It's a societal view of, like, you know, why the Supreme Court should have done anything about the death penalty. And then, like, the differences in what it means to commute a life sentence to life in prison versus giving people that were on death row parole, right?
Yeah.
And so it illustrates a lot, but these types of cases where the dude gets out and kills people again, it's exactly why everyone's so reluctant to make any sort of decisions like that now.
Yeah. Yeah, the jury agrees. On February 18th, 1993, they held a special punishment hearing and they opt to sentence him to death. Now, he goes back to his shenanigans of trying to utilize lawyers to delay and to change his sentence. Ultimately, it rolls its way back into the federal courts and it gets denied all around. The execution date gets rescheduled for November 17th, 1998. And the courts aren't interested in dealing with him anymore. They're done with him. And he is executed at that time. And he is buried in what's known as Peckerwood Hill. It's a cemetery in Huntsville, Texas. Prisoners go there when their family doesn't care to claim their remains. And I thought this was interesting, his last meal was apparently a hamburger that had been shaped into, quote, Kenneth McDuff's request for a steak. So
He didn't even get to pick his last meal.
well, he did, but they didn't give it to him.
Well, it's interesting because the last meal thing it's always an interesting thing that's added to like fictional accounts of people that are about to be executed or whatever.
Yeah.
But largely it is fiction. Like I do know in some cases they do allow for a last meal, but in a lot of cases they literally just get whatever everyone else is having for dinner that night. And we don't have that many executions at this point in time. It's not like we've had some, but it's not like they run rampant, right?
I would agree, yeah. I do think so I've looked at his case a number of times over the years. I've never had a good reason to bring him up.
I do think there's one thing that I wanted to address really quick. So
go ahead,
this
yeah.
brings in two accomplices. Okay. Now, I want to point out that while they are, I guess, accomplices, I mean, there's no indication that, like, when the narrative of this story talks about him being 50 feet away from a police line, police checkpoint, and the female being in the front seat of the car and breaking the windshield and him driving off.
Yeah.
Like, who has corroborated any of that, right?
I'm with you. I know.
Because he drove off, right? I mean, I guess maybe they got his tag number and they could say it was him, but how did they know for sure that, like, that was the night he killed this girl and dumped her body and she wasn't found until 8 years later, right? Okay, so that's a narrative that's been constructed, right? Now, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying I don't necessarily see the evidence. I wasn't sure if you weren't going to say something like he confessed, right? Or he gave information, right?
It's the accomplices that are giving, like, so he's got this one acquaintance, Alva Worley. He tells a bunch of these stories based on him having continued contact with Kenneth.
Well, right, but he doesn't say that he's there for that particular police checkpoint situation.
Right. He doesn't say that he's there. He just is telling what he knows about.
Right, and to me, that's not really enough. But I will say this about the accomplices, because I strongly believe that these are not the types of crimes that people commit with accomplices. And when I consider that, I consider like a meeting of the minds with an accomplice. There's no question that Kenneth McDuff was a bully. Okay. And it never changed, the fact that he was a bully. His murders reflect that, right?
Yeah.
His initial murders reflect that. All the murders that he had, like everything that's happening that we can see happening in his life, is that he was a bully. And he was actually like brought up to be a bully, it seemed like. Okay, and so while these guys are his acquaintances or friends or whatever they want to call it, I don't think that there was necessarily a meeting of the minds in these situations as much as there was a situation where they were with him when he did this stuff. When you have a friend that's a bully, it can be really hard to stand up to them, especially since this guy was so big, right? Now, they don't go into like, I do think that they say that the accomplices were reluctant and when they confess, they put the lesser role of the crime on themselves, which is very common, right?
Yeah.
And, who knows if that's true or not. He was ultimately executed for just Melissa Northrup's murder.
Yeah.
And
He gives up Colleen Reed's the location of her body as well.
Right. Okay. And so from that, we really honestly truly have no idea if he was involved in some of these other murders, right?
Yeah, that's why I'm bringing him up. That's the other part about him is I wanted your take on him. I wanted your take on the accomplished thing, but I wanted your take on him overall.
Well, and so I do. So yes, there are accomplices here, and this is how they made the case against him ultimately. But I need more information. From just what I saw, I don't feel like they're true accomplices. I don't think that they sat at home and said, "Okay, let's go kill some kids," and they went and did it. I think that Kenneth McDuff and his first accomplice, which was Green, Roy Dale Green, I think that they were hanging out, right?
Yeah.
And that this all went down and he was there. And I think sometimes, especially when you're younger, how old was he at this point in time? Could have been like 20-ish.
You mean when he committed the broomstick murders?
18.
He would have been 20 years old.
20 years old. Okay.
Yeah, so he was born March of 1946, and they took place August of 1966.
Right.
So it's 20 and a half years old.
Right. So he's youngish. And so I do think that it could be more of a situation where Roy Dale Green didn't know what he was getting himself into and found himself there. Right.
Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe they did have a meeting of the minds. I could be completely wrong. Right. There could be accomplices all over the place. But I see it less as and not to mention that whole murder was nonsense. I mean, not that the victims died, but what was the point of that? It was just a bully being a bully. That's it.
Yeah.
Right? It didn't accomplish anything except it made him feel like he had accomplished something as a bully. Now, granted, it could have also been him putting his friend in his place, right? Except his friend turned around and turned him in, right?
Yeah.
The backlash here is the fact that somehow this death penalty case ended up with a guy getting out. And I'm of the very strong opinion that without some sort of ordering a new trial or complete exoneration based on new evidence, I'm of the opinion that it's really strange for someone to go from being on death row to walking the streets again. I'm not entirely opposed to it. I do know for certain that Furman was never meant to let killers back out on the street. It was meant to not put people to death based on anything but the actual crime they committed. And in order to do that, the states needed to take it upon themselves to reevaluate who they were putting to death, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I know that that's not what the Supreme Court was aiming to do. It was a collateral thing that happened. I don't know do you know of any other cases right offhand? I don't know of any other cases right offhand. That doesn't mean they don't exist. But this is a perfect example of why, these big decisions matter, right? Because look at, even just following the narrative, look at how many victims happened after he was released when he should have been executed if Furman hadn't occurred, right?
Yeah. Well, my question to you was, one, do you believe the accomplices?
I don't know. I can't really tell.
I do for a really weird reason.
Okay.
There are two of them. They don't know each other, and they're telling real similar stories.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can go along with that. I maintain that I feel like he bullied these acquaintances into these situations.
I think the best example in here is the guy related to Melissa Northrup, where he cons this guy into committing a robbery with him, and the guy's like, you know what, I don't want to do that, so he just doesn't go. I think that's the best example of what he's doing. Like, hey, well, let's go cruise, or we're gonna go do this other thing, and then all of a sudden you're standing in the middle of a kidnapping, rape, and murder.
Right. I think
That's got to be the weirdest thing on the planet.
Right, but if you've got a friend who is an overt bully, which Kenneth McDuff was, he was an overt bully, which means, and to the extent he was always picking on people that were smaller and less powerful than him, right?
Yeah.
And so if he's like that to strangers, he's probably like that to his friends as well, right? And sometimes you really don't know who you're hanging out with, right?
Yeah.
But I seriously could imagine all of a sudden they just find themselves in these random situations, especially the way the first thing went down, shooting randomly into the car, taking one of them. Like it was just all so weird.
Yeah, like it gets much more targeted after that with the crimes they accuse him of. And I say accuse him of because he's linked to those deaths, which they call the broomstick murders. And that's the deaths of Robert Brand, Mark Dunham, and Edna Louise Sullivan. Then he's linked later to Colleen Reed and Melissa Northrup. First, he's linked by accomplice testimony to Colleen Reed. He's tried for Melissa Northrup and found guilty, and that's what actually ends up getting him the death penalty, like actually getting executed. But, there are some similarities there. They're definitely evolving crimes. He goes to prison in there, so they're not that evolved afterwards. And I wanted to ask you, if you were sitting and looking at this case as a cold case investigator today, how do you go back and, in your opinion, like put this together where you knock off, and I don't know that this is exactly what it says, but I did glance at the Wikipedia in this case. Speaking of the sources here, let me just throw this out here. I used an Associated Press article by Mike Cochran that said McDuff will likely take secrets to his grave. Dead man suspect in Gonzalez murder from the Cleveland Times Review. I used Free to Kill from Texas Monthly. I think I already mentioned that one. And then I used a book called Bad Boy from Rosebud and some of a book called Talking with Serial Killers by Christopher Berry D. Bad Boy from Rosebud is, I can't remember the guy's last name, Gary something. Those were the books that came up in the course of all of this. And I'm sure if you go on the Wikipedia, you'll see what I'm about to say. On there, I noticed they list out victims, and they have the 3 broomstick killings, and then they have the 6 murders that I mentioned, but it has a dash and it says 14 plus. Okay. In my opinion, this victim list is kind of sketchy for the 9 victims. I definitely believe he is responsible for the broomstick murders, because I don't think that Roy Green did it or encouraged Kenneth to do it, and then he did these other crimes as well. We know that a jury convicted him of the Melissa Northrup murder, and somehow he told investigators where the body of Colleen Reed was. I have never seen that confirmed that he did it, so that's complicated. Right. This is the woman that was taken from the car wash in Austin in 1991.
Right, and I believe he was bartering her body location to get an extension on his death date, but that it didn't work, right?
How do we investigate these cases?
Well, it's just hit or miss. It seems like he had a pretty contained life, right?
Yeah.
He did have he had a habit of, at least on 2 occasions, involving his friend, right?
Yeah.
The friends talk, right? And then, I don't have a great idea of how big this area is, what we're looking at time and space wise, we know for certain he was in jail from the broomstick murders until he was released in 89, right? So he was in jail for a substantial amount of time, right?
Yeah.
And so we know like no murders in between then are going to be his. And then I find it really hard to I don't know what's available in these cases. I don't know that they have DNA on this dude. And I don't know what kind of evidence might have been collected, but he definitely uses several different the victims that are listed, they have several different manners of homicide, right?
Yeah.
And it makes sense to me that like he fired 6 shots into the car, right? Because he was focusing on like one victim and he had to kill the witnesses or whatever.
Right.
And then it sounds like there were several sex workers who died and they've been attributed to him. And I don't know how you would go back and say definitively that was the case. I know it looks like the police statement links him to at least Brenda Thompson, right?
Yeah.
But does it really?
Well, that's why I'm asking you, because...
Well, I would need to see, like, what does the statement say? Like, if they say for certain that, like, if Brenda Thompson was missing after that day, or if one of the police officers saw her and recognized her, if they had his plate and ran it and said it was his vehicle, and then, when her body is found in 1998, they remember that, oh, yeah, I made a report because I was manning a checkpoint and that guy drove through and I saw her sitting in the truck. Now, see, that could be something that it would have some credibility to it, right? But I mean, they didn't find her that night. They didn't find him that night. He drove through the checkpoint, right?
Yeah.
And he eluded them by turning off his lights. And so to me, like, that doesn't connect it well enough, right? And while it sounds really good, and, in the eyes of Wikipedia, the narrative solves her disappearance and murder, right? Because she had to have been a missing person. She died actually, we don't know when she died, but it's theorized that she died in 1991 and her remains weren't discovered until 1998, right?
Right.
So somebody missed her. They had to have. And it sounds good. And it may be what happened, but just being told that, I can't believe that just on the surface, right?
Right.
I like to think that there's more backing that up, but I've learned that that's not always the case, right?
Yeah.
Now, it could be a situation where, unfortunately, sex workers are in high risk positions a lot of the time. And it is not unusual for sex workers to be victimized by a one-off situation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that makes it really, really hard to either include or discount them when it comes to like the serial type of murders, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I mean, I feel like Kenneth McDuff he's definitely got some issues that are leading him towards like the traditional type of serial killer, right?
Yeah, he seems to have like the take, rape, kill motive in a way.
Right. Like he's got the predator, like I see that coming out of him. It was a really good thing he was in jail all those years. But I also find some of his, like, what I perceive as being like an immature bully, that doesn't necessarily, it's not always as apparent in serial killers, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of like because that's almost like a revenge type motive, right? When you're a bully, you're constantly just,
Right. You're wrong, but that's the motive. Like it's wrong of a bully
exactly.
to kill, but that's the
Right,
reason.
but the reason is they're killing because they're a bully, and so I have my own thoughts about like if a bully killer is a serial killer or not. Now, if you look at this, the narrative that's put out here, this guy was on death row, released, and all these murders happened, and then he was finally executed. I mean, yeah, it looks like a serial killer, right?
Yeah.
I hope that investigators have enough to say, like, whatever it would take for them to say he was responsible for all these, right? Otherwise, there's somebody out there getting away with a murder, right? Any of
Right.
these that
Right.
aren't his murders, because once they've attributed it to him, it's not being investigated any further. And unfortunately, some of the victims are the vulnerable population who's nobody's pushing for their case to be closed, right? I always find it really interesting, which this is across the board. I mean, even like Ted Bundy, I always find it really interesting how they can have somebody on death row and not know everything about them, like everything they've done, everything. Because in my mind, I would get everything out of them before they were executed.
I would think that I would too. I mean, I like to think that there are promises that can be made and minor luxuries that can be traded for a lot of information from those people.
Oh, absolutely. Not to mention, like, I typically, in my everyday life, I don't try to manipulate situations to go my way, but I feel like I would not have any problems doing that with a serial killer.
Yeah.
And if
Well,
you are friends with a serial killer, right, and you're on their side and you empathize with them, you can get a lot of information, I imagine, right? I don't know that for certain.
well, I brought him up today because we're kind of headed into some different types of serial killers in the coming episodes. And, like I said, this guy came up when I was kind of deep into I-70. Turned out not to be a great suspect, but I couldn't get over how interesting some of this was. Sort of the connection to Furman versus Georgia. And then also the did he really do all this? And I get where they're coming from because it is like a lot of these take place in sort of the same pattern you and I have observed in other serial killers. Like Bobby Joe Long comes to mind, where he had that 1 year that he just went crazy. This is very similar to that. And that makes me wonder if there's like a couple more bodies in there, or like, then in my opinion, on the flip side of it, you have to kind of look at the local area. And like, if you've got a really small area with a really small population, which some of this is, then how do you account for sudden murders happening and his, sort of existence and his being tied to a couple of them? And I think Brenda Thompson probably, based on what you and I have talked about over the years and sort of what I've gleaned from your ability to get into these guys' heads, I think that like they probably could have tied him to Brenda Thompson. And I think it's exactly what you said a few minutes ago. I think they have police officers who saw him and knew her. And like there's this whole chase thing that happened.
Right. And I would find that very credible, right? If that were the case and that's what came up and somebody could say, "Oh, she was never seen again," or whatever, right?
Right. And the other thing I was going to point out here, so this happens, and I wonder what you think of this particular thing. And then I'm going to leave this alone. I'm going to kind of like wrap him up for the day. He may come up again in the future because I have some thoughts on how more could be done with his case. But let me ask you this. So in this story that I kind of laid out here, it's pieced together from all these different sources. You don't quite get some of this detail from like something as small as a Wikipedia, but I gave a glossing overview. You've got these women who are found in 91. You've got this whole story that happens where Colleen, not Colleen, Melissa shows back up. Her body's found. We've got, I thought there was one in here. I'm scrolling through now. So September 91. Here we go. So Regenia Deanne Moore, she's the one that he allegedly takes at a Waco, like he's seen with her at a Waco motel. Her body is found September 29th, 1998. I ask you, how do you think you think that's random?
What do you mean? That she's found? I was wondering if Brenda Thompson and Virginia Moore weren't found together or close to one another.
So with Brenda Thompson, she's also found in 1998. But
that's almost like he told them or something.
I was just wondering if he was using bait, because he gets executed like 60 days after their bodies are found.
Well, right. And so, see, that would also be credible, right? I mean, it's very hard to give up a body unless you're the person responsible for putting it there.
Correct.
And so, to me, I mean, nobody says that anywhere, though, that I can find.
No, I would have to. I have 2 more books on this guy that I haven't got to yet. I was just, he's of interest to me because
I definitely think it's interesting that these, like, the murders that were committed in 1991, they're found in 1998. There's no information readily available as to, like, where they were actually found, right?
Yeah, like if it was random or if it was connected.
Yeah, exactly. And so to me, that would lend to credibility, right? As far as like if they were found next to one another, if he had like a dumping spot. But like we're talking about like a 5-day difference, right?
Yeah.
Between like Brenda Thompson and Regenia Deanne Moore. And the dates come from somewhere, and then the bodies being found, they come from somewhere. We just don't have that information. It is entirely possible he was bargaining, especially at that time, like you said, because he attempted to use Colleen Reed, and so they found her, right? And so she was just a little bit after the other 2, right? So it's possible that he was giving up murders in like chronological order, right? And he'd already given up Thompson and Regina Moore.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I don't know if you read this as we went through. I noted this as coming from the Hometown by Handlebar.com. I don't know exactly what the article title was. They had a bunch of the news clippings together, and it had this tidbit. I copy pasted the tidbit. So in 1985, a woman shows up to visit him in Huntsville. And she tells him this story. And he goes to thinking about it. And I don't know how this information comes out, but she is his 21-year-old daughter. And in 1964, he had raped a woman and left her for dead, but didn't finish the job. So this is prior to the broomstick murders. He would have been, 17, 18 years old. She got up and, was able to walk away. And not only did she survive, but she was pregnant and she had this child. And there's a story out there that he tries to persuade her to smuggle him drugs. And tells her this thing about they can go to Las Vegas and he could be her pimp and they could make some money. It is the weirdest story. And I think I read it on Hometown by Handlebar.com.
Okay.
I just
Well,
thought, I figured that was a fun tidbit to kind of close
that's
out.
crazy. But him being, well, I don't know. He may not have had any intention of killing her mother.
Yeah, I don't know.
But that could explain why he had to have a friend with him when he went in for the second. But of course, he took on, what, 4 victims? 1, 2.
Yeah, he took on multiple victims by himself, but like he did so we have a record of basically 3 accomplices. One is failed because the guy doesn't want to go with him. That's the last murder with Melissa Northrup. And then we've got Roy Green. And we have Alva, who testifies against him later too. It's interesting. I've never seen a lot of accomplice information. I know it exists. I know there's been accomplices to serial killers, and a lot of times they were people who would have ordinarily been victims of the serial killer. That doesn't fit here, though. It's not like a Dean Coral situation. It's not recruiting or anything. Anyways, that's all I got on Kenneth McDuff for now. Do you have anything else on him?
Nope.
Thank you so much for listening today. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
All right, so I'm going to tell you guys a few things about some of the folks who are helping sponsor our show. Now, Labrati Creations sponsors our show, and you can always use the Crime XS code there. You can also just message them at Labrati Creations, and they will generally do something for the people who come from True Crime XS. They were our very first sponsor. They've done a lot for the show, and that code is CrimeXS at LabratiCreations.com. The first new advertisers that we have, and I've selected all of these guys. I've selected all of these advertisers. So the very first one is Cure. Now, I'm going to tell you guys about this, about Cure as being one of our sponsors. If you're an athlete, you know that proper hydration is key to peak performance, but plain water can be boring and sports drinks can be filled with artificial ingredients and added sugars. That's why we love Cure. It's a clean and effective way to stay hydrated and perform at your best. I use it late in the day when I switch out of caffeine mode. Specifically, when I hit the pool or I go play tennis with my wife, I use Cure to help me stay hydrated. It helps me recover after a long day. Now, you guys may not know this, but I build things. And right now, I've been building several structures on our property out here. Among those is a new podcast studio space for myself. I do a lot of that work at night and into the wee hours, and I always have some Cure with me to go into my aluminum water bottle. Hydration is not just about filling up my aluminum bottle with water. Cure Hydration is an oral rehydration solution that contains the perfect balance of electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb water and rehydrate quickly. Whether I'm building things or putting the podcast together or chasing these dogs that you sometimes hear in my studio up and down the trails to get them worn out, Cure Hydration is the way that I choose to go. Cure Hydration is an oral rehydration solution, or an ORS, that contains the perfect balance of electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb water and to rehydrate quickly. The formula is made with all natural ingredients like coconut water powder and pink Himalayan salt. It's free from artificial flavors, from sweeteners, and preservatives. Cure Hydration is vegan, gluten-free, and non-GMO, making it a great option for anyone with dietary restrictions or preferences. The packets are convenient and easy to use. You just mix them with your water and you drink. They're perfect for on the go. They're perfect for travel. And anytime you need a quick and effective hydration boost, ready to combat dehydration, then you try Cure today and feel the difference for yourself. You can use code TrueCrimeXS for 20% off your order. That's TrueCrimeXS I have a link that I'm putting in the most recent episode show notes, and True Crime Access will get you 20% off. Our second sponsor for the show today is Laird. Now, Laird has a list of things that they want me to tell you about. They have better ingredients with amazing taste and functional benefits. They have a superfood creamer crafted from the highest quality, all-natural, real food ingredients. All Laird products are sustainably sourced and thoroughly tested to ensure that you're incorporating the cleanest, finest fuel into your routine. They have all natural whole food ingredients, and they contain naturally occurring MCTs made from coconut oil. There's no artificial flavors, there's no colors or additives, and there's no sugar from highly refined corn syrup. They want me to talk about my love of coffee, but the truth is, I don't do much with coffee. But let me tell you someone who does. My wife has to have a cup of coffee every day. Now, I've fallen off recently, but one of the big things that I've done since the beginning of our relationship is she used to go and get a Starbucks every morning. I have substituted that out by always trying to make her coffee. It's not going to be every single day of time from when I met her, but for the most part, almost every day, I make her coffee. I put her creamers together, and I make sure that she has a good way to start her day. So with Laird, he started experimenting with his morning ritual almost 2 decades ago. He found that when he started adding fats to his morning cup, like coconut oil, he had amazing energy throughout the rest of his day. He gradually perfected this recipe for an epic cup of fuel, and he began sharing it with his friends in the surf community. I'm an ocean guy, so I saw this item and I was like, okay, we're going to try this one out. Are you ready to feel more energized, more focused, and supported? Go to lairdsuperfood.com and add nourishing plant-based foods to fuel you from sunrise to sunset. And you can use our promo code at checkout to save 15% off your purchase today. Our offer code for this for Laird is going to be True Crime XS. Pretty much everywhere except for Labarde Creations, if you use True Crime XS, that will get you, at Laird, it'll get you 15% off. At some of the other places, they'll get you 20% off. I'm going to tell you about 2 more sponsors today. So the first one is, the third one is Liquid IV. So let's talk about the real reasons that you need to hydrate. Late night TV binging, back-to-back Zoom meetings, going on a walk with your friends. Everyday hydration is not just for high energy athletic endeavors. Liquid IV is the #1 powdered hydration brand in America. It's now available in sugar-free. This is years in the making, but Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free uses a proprietary zero-sugar hydration solution with no artificial sweeteners. It's got 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, but it's also got 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness. Liquid IV hydrates 2 times faster than water alone. Keep your daily routine exciting with 3 new flavors. They've got white peach, green grape, and lemon lime. I love all of these flavors, but I think that my favorite is probably the green grape. White peach I use as a secondary flavor, and lemon lime I leave here for my kids and my wife. Liquid IV believes that equitable access to clean and abundant water is the foundation of a healthier world. They also partner with leading organizations to fund and foster innovative solutions that help communities protect both their water and their futures. To date, Liquid IV has donated over 39 million servings in 50 plus countries around the world. You can get 20% off when you grab your Liquid IV Hydration Multiplier sugar-free or any other variant at liquidiv.com and use code TrueCrimeXS at checkout. That's 20% off anything you order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code TrueCrimeXS at liquidiv.com. And the last sponsor I want to tell you about is Zencastr. We are part of Zencastr's creative network. We've been using Zencastr since about midway into our first season. Meg and I experimented with a lot of different ways to put the podcast together. And the truth is, Zencastr was an integral ingredient to us being able to bring you this show. It's so easy. It's now super easy. You can record a podcast with Zencaster. You can log in using your browser and you start recording a high quality podcast right away. You can record studio quality sound and up to 4K video with your guest. You get to feel a sense of zen knowing that Zencaster's multi-layered backups ensure you will always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable. You sound your best. I mean, if you've ever worried about what you sound like, Zencaster's post-production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes those ums and ahs in your recordings. It removes those awkward pauses in conversation too. You can set the right podcast loudness and levels while reducing background noise with a click of a button. That's how you don't hear my dogs every second of every episode. Zencaster is all in one. If you've thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are now over. With Zencaster's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place, and you can distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations. Just go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code TrueCrimeXS, and you're going to get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. You can also check out the other plans they have available. I want you to have the same easy experiences that I do for all my podcasting and content needs. So Zencastr.com/pricing. The offer code is TrueCrimeXS, and it's time for you to share your story today. We are also adding New Era as a sponsor for the show. New Era Cap is a headwear and apparel brand founded in 1920 in Buffalo, New York. Now, I actually have some experience with New Era caps. My dad and I have been through multiple iterations of baseball caps through the years. We collect different styles, different eras, and now my teenager has started his own cap collection and has several New Eras as the centerpieces. Our favorite teams may not be the same, but our outfits are all topped with the same New Era ball caps. We love the quality and the ability to wear what the players are wearing. Not to mention, New Era is the leading headwear manufacturer with quality licensed products. You can support your favorite college or pro team in style from the official headwear provider for the MLB, NFL, and NBA. You can get a stylish accessory for your everyday ensemble and support True Crime XS. Just shop the official headwear and get 15% off when you go to neweracap.com. That's neweracap.com/TrueCrimeXS. You can also use the code TrueCrimeXS at checkout. That's it. That's all you have to do. And that's 15% off your order using the promo code TrueCrimeXS.